The manicured lawns of Pine Hill stretched endlessly under the morning sun, each blade of grass perfectly trimmed, each flower bed meticulously maintained. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode their bikes without fear, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the most scandalous gossip usually involved someone's rose bushes or a property line dispute. But on that fateful October morning in 2019, the illusion of suburban perfection would be shattered forever by a crime so shocking, so deeply rooted in human obsession and betrayal, that it would leave an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about the people living next door. The screams that pierced the early dawn air came from 42 Elm Street, where Jennifer Morrison lay in a pool of her own blood, her life brutally cut short by someone she had trusted, someone she had considered a friend. What the residents of Pine Hill couldn't have known was that this wasn't just a random act of violence or a burglary gone wrong. This was the culmination of a twisted tale that had been brewing for months beneath the surface of their perfect little community, a story that involved forbidden desires, dangerous liaisons, and an obsession that would ultimately consume everyone it touched. Daniel Fletcher had always been the kind of man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. At 38, his salt and pepper hair and confident demeanor made him the envy of other husbands in the neighborhood. As a successful architect, he had designed some of the most beautiful homes in Pine Hill, including the very house where Jennifer Morrison would take her last breath. His wife, Linda, was equally impressive, a dedicated elementary school teacher whose warm smile, a gentle nature, made her beloved by students and parents alike. They had been married for 12 years. And from the outside, their relationship seemed to be everything a marriage should be. Mark and Jennifer Morrison had moved to Pine Hill 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of a safe community and excellent schools for their future family. Mark, a financial advisor with a thriving practice, was known for his quick wit and generous nature. He was the type of man who would shovel his elderly neighbor's driveway without being asked, and who always brought the best wine to dinner parties. Jennifer, with her striking auburn hair and infectious laugh, had quickly become one of the most popular women in the neighborhood. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a local tech company and had a talent for bringing people together, hosting elaborate dinner parties that became the social highlight of Pine Hill's calendar. The friendship between the Fletchers and the Morrisons began innocently enough. They met at a neighborhood barbecue, bonding over their shared love of good food and travel. Soon, they were inseparable, spending weekends together, taking couples vacations, and becoming the kind of friends who could call each other at any hour of the day or night. Their children, if they had any, would have grown up together. Their retirements would have been spent reminiscing about the good old days. At least, that's how it should have been. The conversation that would change everything happened on a warm summer evening in 2018. The two couples were sitting on the Fletcher's back patio, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the comfortable haze of good wine. The conversation had turned to relationships, as it often did when couples spent time together, and somehow, almost as if by accident, the topic of open marriages came up. It was Jennifer who first mentioned it, laughing as she recounted an article she'd read about couples who had successfully navigated non-monogamous relationships. What started as casual conversation became something more serious over the following weeks. Phone calls between the couples became more frequent, more intimate. The boundaries of their friendships began to blur as they discussed possibilities that seemed both thrilling and terrifying. The idea of swapping partners wasn't something any of them had seriously considered before, but there was something intoxicating about the taboo nature of it all. Something that made their ordinary suburban lives feel suddenly electric with possibility. After weeks of careful discussion and the establishment of what they believed were ironclad rules, no emotional attachments, complete discretion, and the understanding that their marriages came first, they decided to take the plunge. The first encounter was awkward and nervous, filled with uncertain glances and hesitant touches. But it was also exhilarating in a way none of them had expected. For a few hours, they weren't just suburban couples going through the motions of married life. They were adventurous, spontaneous, alive in a way they hadn't felt in years. What followed were months of carefully orchestrated encounters. They would meet at hotels outside of town or take weekend trips to secluded cabins where they could explore this new dynamic without fear of discovery. The arrangement seemed to breathe new life into both marriages. Daniel and Linda reported feeling more connected than they had in years, while Mark and Jennifer seemed to glow with a renewed sense of intimacy and adventure. But beneath the surface, something darker was taking root. Daniel had always been a man of intense passions. When he fell in love with architecture, he threw himself into it completely, working 18-hour days and dreaming of buildings in his sleep. When he decided to marry Linda, he pursued her with a single-minded determination that she found both flattering and overwhelming. Now, that same intensity was being directed toward Jennifer Morrison, and what had started as physical attraction was quickly morphing into something much more dangerous. At first, the signs were subtle. Daniel would find excuses to drive past Jennifer's house on his way to work. He would volunteer to help with projects that Mark usually handled, always with a ready explanation that seemed perfectly innocent. He began paying closer attention to Jennifer's schedule, learning when she went to yoga class, when she did her grocery shopping, when she would be alone. Linda noticed these changes but attributed them to the excitement of their new arrangement. After all, wasn't it natural that he would be thinking about Jennifer more often now that she was part of their intimate circle? The first real warning sign came during a weekend trip to a lake house that the couples had rented together. Daniel had been unusually possessive of Jennifer's time, insisting that they take long walks together while leaving Mark and Linda behind. On the last night of the trip, as they sat around a campfire sharing stories and laughing, Daniel made a comment that made everyone uncomfortable. Looking directly at Jennifer, he said, "You know, we could all just disappear from our old lives. Start fresh somewhere new. Just the people who really matter." The comment hung in the air like smoke, and while Mark laughed it off as too much wine talking, Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Daniel's eyes when he looked at her, an intensity that went far beyond the physical attraction they were supposed to be exploring. It was the look of a man who was falling in love, and that was never supposed to be part of their arrangement. Jennifer began to pull back, making excuses when Daniel suggested they spend time alone together. She started declining invitations to the elaborate date nights that had become a regular part of their routine. When Daniel asked why, she tried to be diplomatic, suggesting that they all needed to be careful not to let things get too complicated. But Daniel wasn't satisfied with her vague explanations. He pressed her for more details, his questions becoming increasingly invasive and desperate. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in September. Mark was out of town on business, and Daniel showed up at Jennifer's house unannounced. She let him in, thinking he might have news about Linda or perhaps needed to discuss something related to their group dynamic. Instead, he sat down in her living room and began telling her about his feelings. He spoke of destiny and soulmates, of a love that transcended the conventional boundaries of marriage and society. He painted a picture of a life they could have together, free from the constraints of their current relationships. Jennifer listened in growing horror as Daniel revealed the depth of his obsession. This wasn't the casual physical attraction they had agreed to explore. This was a man who had constructed an entire fantasy life around her, complete with plans for their future together. When she gently tried to explain that he was misunderstanding the nature of their arrangement, Daniel became agitated. He accused her of leading him on, of making promises she had no intention of keeping. The conversation escalated until Jennifer, feeling genuinely frightened for the first time, asked him to leave. But Daniel didn't leave. Not really. Over the following days, he began showing up everywhere Jennifer went. He appeared at her yoga class, claiming he was thinking of taking up the practice. He lingered in the parking lot of her office building, waiting for her to come out so he could accidentally bump into her. He sent her text messages at all hours of the day and night, professing his love and begging her to reconsider their relationship. Jennifer confided in Linda, hoping that Daniel's wife might be able to talk sense into him. Linda listened with a mixture of sympathy and growing alarm. She had known about Daniel's tendency toward obsession, but she had never seen him direct that intensity toward another person before. Part of her was jealous, But a larger part was genuinely concerned about what her husband might be capable of if Jennifer continued to reject him. Linda tried to reason with Daniel, but her attempts only seemed to make him more desperate. He accused her of not understanding the depth of his feelings, of being jealous of what he and Jennifer shared. He began staying out late, claiming he was working on projects, but Linda suspected he was driving by Jennifer's house or finding other ways to keep tabs on her. Their marriage, which had seemed stronger than ever just months before, began to crumble under the weight of Daniel's obsession. Finally, Jennifer reached the conclusion that many women in her situation come to: the only way to end the nightmare was to cut off all contact completely. She called a meeting with all four of them, intending to announce that she was ending their arrangement permanently. The meeting took place at a quiet restaurant outside of town, chosen specifically because Jennifer hoped the public setting would prevent any dramatic outbursts. When Jennifer announced her decision, Mark was surprised but ultimately supportive. He had noticed the tension between Daniel and Jennifer and was relieved to have an explanation for the strange atmosphere that had been building between their two couples. Linda nodded her agreement, though her expression was difficult to read. Daniel, however, sat in stunned silence, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Disbelief, anger, desperation, and finally, something that looked almost like hatred. The drive home was tense, with Daniel refusing to speak to any of them. Over the following days, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to work regularly, spending his days driving aimlessly around town or sitting in his home office staring at photographs from their group trips. Linda found evidence that he had been researching Jennifer's daily routine, including printouts of her work schedule and maps of her regular routes around town. The final confrontation happened on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Jennifer had been working late at the office, trying to catch up on projects that had been neglected during the drama of the past few weeks. When she finally left the building at nearly 9 o'clock, she found Daniel waiting for her in the parking lot. He looked terrible, unshaven, wearing wrinkled clothes, with wild eyes that reflected the parking lot lights like those of a nocturnal animal. Jennifer's first instinct was to run, but Daniel blocked her path to her car. He began talking rapidly, desperately, about how she was making a mistake, how they were meant to be together, how he couldn't live without her. Jennifer tried to remain calm, speaking to him in the soothing tone she might use with a frightened animal, but Daniel was beyond reason. When she finally managed to get around him and unlock her car, he grabbed her arm so tightly that she knew there would be bruises. "You can't just throw away what we have," he said, his voice breaking. "You can't pretend that what happened between us didn't mean anything." Jennifer pulled free and got in her car, locking the doors immediately. As she drove away, she could see Daniel in her rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot in the rain, looking like a man whose world had just ended. That night, Jennifer called Linda and begged her to get Daniel professional help. She spoke of restraining orders and police reports, of the fear that was now governing every aspect of her daily life. Linda promised to do something, but privately, she wondered if it was already too late. Daniel had been growing increasingly unstable, and Linda had begun to fear that he might do something drastic. She was right to be afraid. On the night of October 15th, Mark Morrison was in Chicago on a business trip, staying at a downtown hotel and preparing for a morning presentation. Jennifer had spoken to him earlier that evening, mentioning that she was feeling uneasy and might ask her sister to come stay with her for a few days. Mark had suggested she call the police if Daniel continued to harass her, but Jennifer was reluctant to involve the authorities in what she still hoped could be resolved privately. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, Daniel Fletcher used a spare key, one that Jennifer had given to Linda months earlier during a period when they were house-sitting for each other, to enter the Morrison home. Jennifer woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed, silhouetted against the hallway light like a figure from a nightmare. In his hand was a kitchen knife from her own kitchen, its blade reflecting the dim light filtering through her bedroom curtains. "You left me no choice," Daniel said, his voice eerily calm. "If I can't have you, then no one can." Jennifer tried to scream, but Daniel was on her before she could make more than a strangled sound. The attack was brutal and swift, driven by months of pent-up obsession and rage. When it was over, Daniel stood over Jennifer's body, his hands covered in blood, his mind reeling with the enormity of what he had done. The 911 call came from a neighbor who had heard what sounded like breaking glass, followed by a brief commotion and then silence. By the time police arrived at the scene, Daniel was long gone, but the evidence of his presence was overwhelming. Blood evidence, fingerprints, and security camera footage from neighboring houses would later place him definitively at the scene of the crime. Daniel returned home to find Linda waiting for him in their kitchen, her face pale with the knowledge of what he had done. His clothes were soaked with blood, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what had happened. Linda, faced with the reality of her husband's crime, made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of calling the police, she chose to help him cover up the murder. Working with desperate efficiency, Linda helped Daniel dispose of his bloody clothes, cleaned any evidence from their house, and constructed an alibi that placed them both at home watching television all evening. She coached him on what to say when the police inevitably came to question them, reminding him to express appropriate shock and grief at the news of Jennifer's death. The investigation that followed was thorough and professional, led by Detective Sarah Mitchell, a 20-year veteran of the force who had seen every kind of human brutality imaginable. From the beginning, she suspected that Jennifer's murder was not a random crime. The lack of forced entry, the personal nature of the attack, and the absence of any theft suggested that the killer was someone Jennifer knew and trusted. When Detective Mitchell first interviewed the Fletchers, they presented as a grieving couple devastated by the loss of their dear friend. Daniel played the part of the shocked neighbor perfectly, expressing disbelief that such a thing could happen in their quiet community. Linda was equally convincing, tearfully recounting their last conversation with Jennifer and expressing regret that they hadn't done more to help her feel safe. But Detective Mitchell had not built her reputation by accepting surface appearances. She began digging deeper into the relationships Jennifer had with everyone in her life, including the Fletchers. What she discovered was a trail of increasingly desperate text messages from Daniel to Jennifer, messages that painted a picture of a man spiraling into dangerous obsession. The breakthrough came when a neighbor, prompted by news coverage of the investigation, contacted police to report seeing a car matching Daniel's parked near the Morrison house on the night of the murder. Security camera footage from a nearby business confirmed the sighting, showing Daniel's distinctive vehicle arriving at the scene around 2 a.m. and leaving approximately 45 minutes later. Faced with this evidence, along with the incriminating text messages and witness testimony about Daniel's increasingly erratic behavior, Detective Mitchell obtained a search warrant for the Fletcher home. What they found there was damning. Despite Linda's careful cleaning, luminol tests revealed traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards of their garage. Hidden in a storage area, investigators discovered remnants of burned clothing that matched fibers found at the crime scene. The arrest came on a gray November morning, exactly 3 weeks after Jennifer's murder. Daniel was taken into custody without incident, his face showing no emotion as Detective Mitchell read him his rights. Linda was arrested hours later, charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice for her role in the cover-up. The trial that followed captivated the entire region. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, curious onlookers, and residents of Pine Hill who struggled to reconcile the Daniel Fletcher they thought they knew with the man who had committed such a brutal crime. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose obsession had grown beyond all rational bounds, whose inability to accept rejection had led him to commit the ultimate act of possession and control. Daniel's defense team attempted to argue that the killing had been a crime of passion, committed in a moment of emotional breakdown rather than cold-blooded murder. They pointed to his previously clean record, his standing in the community, and testimony about his deteriorating mental state in the weeks leading up to the crime. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the calculated nature of his entry into Jennifer's home, using the spare key, suggested premeditation rather than impulse. Linda's trial was separate but equally compelling. Her defense attorney argued that she had been acting under extreme emotional duress, terrified of losing everything she had built with Daniel and panicked by the magnitude of his crime. Character witnesses testified to her years of service as an educator and her previously unblemished reputation. The prosecution, however, maintained that her actions had helped a murderer evade justice and had prolonged the suffering of Jennifer's family and friends. In the end, justice was served, though it could never restore what had been lost. Daniel Fletcher was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke of the calculated nature of the crime and the devastating impact it had had on the community. Daniel would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his architectural dreams and suburban fantasies replaced by the harsh reality of a concrete cell. Linda Fletcher received a sentence of 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Her cooperation with the investigation and her previously clean record had worked in her favor, but she would still pay a heavy price for her decision to help cover up Jennifer's murder. The woman who had once been beloved by her students and respected by her community was now a convicted felon, her career and reputation permanently destroyed. Mark Morrison, left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, found some measure of peace in knowing that Jennifer's killers had been brought to justice. In a victim impact statement read at Daniel's sentencing, he spoke of the vibrant, loving woman who had been taken from him and of the life they would never have together. He established a foundation in Jennifer's memory, focused on supporting victims of stalking and domestic violence, turning his grief into a force for positive change. The residents of Pine Hill slowly began to heal from the trauma that had shattered their sense of security. Property values initially dropped as the stigma of the murder affected the neighborhood. But eventually, new families moved in, drawn by the same promises of safety and community that had once attracted the Fletchers and Morrisons. The house where Jennifer died was eventually sold and renovated, its dark history gradually fading into local legend. Detective Mitchell, reflecting on the case years later, would often use it as an example of how quickly seemingly normal relationships can spiral into deadly obsession. The wife-swapping arrangement that had begun as an adventure for two couples had ended with one woman dead, two people in prison, and countless lives forever changed. It served as a stark reminder that the facades people present to the world often hide much darker truths beneath the surface. The story of Daniel Fletcher and Jennifer Morrison became a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing certain boundaries in relationships and the devastating consequences that can follow when obsession replaces reason. It highlighted the importance of recognizing warning signs of dangerous behavior and the need for victims of stalking to take threats seriously, even when they come from people they once trusted. As the years passed, the intensity of the media coverage faded, but the lessons of the case remained relevant. In an age of increasingly complex relationship dynamics and social experimentation, the Pine Hill murder served as a reminder that some risks are simply too dangerous to take, and that the human capacity for obsession and violence can lurk beneath even the most respectable exterior. The ultimate tragedy was not just Jennifer's death, but the complete destruction of two families and a community's loss of innocence. What had begun as a quest for excitement and novelty had ended in the most primitive of human emotions: jealousy, obsession, and ultimately, murder. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would echo through the lives of everyone touched by this tragedy for years to come. In the end, Daniel Fletcher's inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, between consensual adult exploration and possessive ownership, had cost Jennifer Morrison her life and destroyed his own. His twisted interpretation of love had led to the ultimate act of violence, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trust the most. The case file was eventually closed, the trials concluded, and the sentences served. But for those who lived through it, the memory of that October night when obsession turned to murder would never truly fade. It served as an eternal reminder that beneath the surface of any seemingly perfect community, darkness can take root and grow, fed by human weakness and unchecked desire, until it explodes in a violence that changes everything forever. Justice was served, but the price paid by everyone involved was higher than anyone could have imagined when four friends first decided to explore the boundaries of their relationships on that warm summer evening so long ago. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new true crime content daily, covering cases you know and many you don't. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that deserve to be heard. See you in the next video.